It is June in the year 1381. The roads leading to London are choked with people, tens of thousands of them. They are the common people of England, and they are marching on the capital armed with scythes, axes, and a burning sense of injustice. They marched with a purpose, and they carried a list of demands that threatened to overturn the structure of their world. This was the Peasants' Revolt, one of the most sudden and widespread popular uprisings in English history, a moment when the powerless decided they had had enough. Over the course of this episode, we will journey back to the 14th century to understand what life was like for the people who powered the feudal system. We will seek to answer the fundamental questions at the heart of this rebellion. What pushed a normally obedient population to such a radical and violent breaking point? Who were the leaders that emerged from the crowd, like Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball, to give the movement a voice? And what did they truly want to achieve? Part 1. England before the revolt. 14th century England was a society built on a rigid and unforgiving structure, one that was considered to be ordained by God himself. At the very top was the king, who owned all the land by divine right. Below him were the great nobles and the high-ranking clergy, the barons, dukes, and bishops, who held vast estates granted to them by the king in exchange for military service and loyalty. Below them were knights and lesser lords. At the very bottom, forming the immense base of this social pyramid, were the common people, the peasantry. This group made up more than 90% of the population, and their lives were defined by one thing above all else: work. The fundamental unit of this world was the manor. Consider a small village, perhaps a few dozen single-room thatched roof houses clustered around a parish church. Surrounding the village are vast, open fields divided into long, narrow strips. A portion of this land, often the best and most fertile part, was the lord's demesne, his personal property. The rest was allocated to the peasants who lived and worked on his estate. But this land was not theirs. They merely held it from the lord in exchange for a complex web of duties and obligations. The majority of these people were legally classified as villeins or serfs. A serf was not free. The defining feature of serfdom was being legally tied to the land. A serf could not leave the manor without the lord's permission. They could not move to a different village for a better opportunity, nor could they go to a town to learn a trade. Their children were born into the same status, bound to the same piece of land. Their lives were governed by a relentless cycle of labor owed to their lord. The most significant of these duties was week work. For a set number of days each week, typically 2 or 3, a male serf had to leave his own strips of land and go to work on the lord's demesne. This was unpaid labor. He would plough the lord's fields with his own oxen, sow the lord's seeds, and weed the lord's crops. At the busiest times of the year, such as the harvest or haymaking, the lord could demand boon work, which was extra compulsory labor from the entire family to ensure his crops were brought in quickly and safely. Only after these obligations were fulfilled could a peasant turn his attention to the strips of land that he relied upon to feed his own family. The lord's power extended into every corner of a serf's life through a series of fees and taxes. If a serf wanted to grind his grain into flour, he was forbidden from using his own hand mill. He had to take it to the lord's mill, where he would pay a portion of his grain as a fee. If he wanted to bake bread, he had to use the lord's oven and pay again. If he wanted to brew ale, he had to pay for the privilege. Justice, too, was the lord's business. Any disputes or minor crimes were settled in the manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward. Fines for everything from a straying animal to an insult were a steady source of income for the manor. Perhaps the most hated of all were the taxes known as heriot and merche. Heriot was a death tax. When a serf died, the lord of the manor had the right to seize his most valuable possession, which was almost always his best ox or cow. For a family that had just lost its primary worker, this was a devastating economic blow, often pushing them to the brink of starvation. It was a cruel reminder that even in death, they did not truly own what they had. Merche was a fee paid to the lord when a serf's daughter got married. This was justified as compensation to the lord for losing a potential worker, especially if she married a man from outside the manor. To the peasants, however, It felt like an intrusive and humiliating assertion of the Lord's control over their personal lives and their families. Life for the vast majority was a constant, back-breaking struggle for survival, with little hope for advancement and a social structure that was designed to keep them firmly in their place. In the middle of the 14th century, this ancient and seemingly unbreakable system was about to be shattered by an event of unimaginable horror. In the summer of 1348, ships docking in the south of England brought with them an invisible and terrifying passenger, the bubonic plague, a disease that would come to be known as the Black Death. It spread like wildfire, reaching London by the autumn and covering the entire country by the following year. The disease was terrifying. Its victims developed painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes, a raging fever, and then, in the majority of cases, suffered a swift and agonizing death. No one knew what caused it. They blamed it on corrupted air, the alignment of the planets, or the wrath of a vengeful god. Medicine was powerless to stop it. It killed indiscriminately, rich and poor, young and old, but the crowded and unsanitary conditions of village life meant the peasantry suffered the most. The sheer scale of the mortality was apocalyptic. Modern estimates suggest that in the space of just over 2 years, from 1348 to 1350, the Black Death wiped out between 40 and 50% of England's population. Entire villages were abandoned, their inhabitants dead or fled. Fields lay unplowed, and livestock wandered untended. The psychological impact was immense, creating a society gripped by fear and obsessed with death. The plague also had a profound and utterly transformative economic consequence. For the first time in centuries, the fundamental law of supply and demand tipped dramatically in favor of the workers who had survived. Before the plague, England was arguably overpopulated. There was a surplus of people and a scarcity of land and work. This gave the landowners, the lords of the manors, all the power. They could demand high rents and low wages, knowing there was always someone else desperate for the opportunity. After the plague, the situation was completely reversed. Suddenly, there was a massive labor shortage. Lords of the manor now had vast tracts of land with no one to work them. They became desperate for tenants and farmhands. For the survivors among the peasantry, this was a revolutionary change. They were now a valuable and scarce resource. This new reality ignited what we might call the first great labor movement in English history. Peasants began to demand higher wages for their work, and they got them. A skilled farm worker who might have earned 2 or 3 pence a day before the plague could now command double that. The balance of power had shifted. If one lord refused to pay the new, higher rates, his workers might simply abandon the manor and walk to the next village, where his desperate neighbor would likely hire them on the spot, no questions asked. Although it was still technically illegal for a serf to leave his manor, the old rules became impossible to enforce. There was chaos, and a lord was more concerned with getting his harvest in than with tracking down a fugitive laborer. This new economic freedom began to dissolve the foundations of serfdom. Many landlords, unable to find enough people to work their own demesne lands, began to give up on direct farming. Instead, they started renting out all of their land for cash. They were willing to commute the old labor services into fixed annual rent payments. This suited the peasants, who now had more time to work for themselves and could profit from their own labor. For the first time, a significant portion of the English population experienced real economic mobility. A hard-working family could accumulate a small surplus, perhaps rent more land, and improve their standing. A new sense of worth and rising expectations took root. They had survived the Great Pestilence. They had seen the old order crumble, and they had tasted a new kind of freedom. They would not give it up easily. In response to this new reality, the ruling class fought back. The king, Edward III, and his parliament of wealthy landowners were horrified by this shift in the social order. They saw the peasants' demands as an outrageous act of insubordination. In their view, the common folk were becoming greedy and arrogant, refusing to show the proper deference to their social superiors. To them, this was a threat to the God-given structure of society itself. Their solution was to turn back the clock, using the full power of the law to force the world back to the way it had been before the Black Death. In 1349, the king issued the Ordinance of Labourers, which was followed 2 years later, in 1351, by a formal Act of Parliament known as the Statute of Labourers. This legislation was a landmark moment in English history, and it became a source of deep and lasting resentment for the next generation. Its aims were simple and brutal. First, it imposed a mandatory wage freeze. It became illegal for any employer to offer, or any worker to accept, wages higher than the rates that were common in the year 1346 before the plague had hit. In an instant, the economic gains the peasants had made were criminalized. Second, the statute introduced a form of forced labor. It decreed that every able-bodied man and woman under the age of 60 who did not have land of their own was required to work for any employer who demanded it at the legally fixed low wages. Refusing to work or leaving a job before the end of an agreed term became a criminal offense, punishable by fines or being put in the stocks. This effectively stripped laborers of their only real power, the power to withhold their labor or seek a better offer. Third, it attempted to fix prices for essential goods so that artisans like blacksmiths and shoemakers couldn't profit from the labor shortage either. To enforce all of this, the government created a new system of special courts, overseen by local gentry serving as justices of laborers. These men, themselves landowners, with a vested interest in keeping wages low, were tasked with prosecuting offenders. For 30 years, from 1351 right up to the eve of the revolt in 1381, these courts were in session, handing out fines and punishments to thousands of people whose only crime was trying to earn a fair wage in a free market. The Statute of Laborers was a catastrophic failure in one sense, and a bitter success in another. It failed to stop wage inflation completely. The economic reality of the labor shortage was simply too powerful. However, it was successful in creating a deep-seated grievance that festered for 3 decades. It was a clear and unambiguous piece of class legislation, an alliance of the crown and the landowners designed specifically to suppress the economic aspirations of the working population. To the peasants and artisans, the law felt profoundly unjust. It was a symbol of a corrupt government that used its power to protect the interests of the rich and powerful. The legal system, which was supposed to provide justice, was now the instrument of their oppression. This sense of betrayal, this feeling that the entire establishment was rigged against them, would become a crucial ingredient in the explosive mixture that was building across the country. The final element that brought this simmering pot to a boil was war. For decades, England had been embroiled in a costly and seemingly endless conflict with France, a series of campaigns that would later be known as the 100 Years' War. In its early stages, under King Edward III, England had seen famous victories at Crécy and Poitiers. These victories brought significant plunder and ransom money, which helped to finance the war effort. However, by the late 1370s, the tide had turned. The old king was dead, and his successor was his grandson, a boy named Richard II, who would come to the throne at the age of just 10. The government was now run by a council of powerful nobles, dominated by the young king's ambitious and deeply unpopular uncle, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. He was one of the wealthiest men in Europe, and he was widely seen as arrogant, corrupt, and the architect of England's failing war policy. The war was going badly. English armies were suffering defeats, and hard-won territories in France were being lost. Worse still, the French and their Castilian allies were now taking the fight to English shores. Their fleets raided and burned towns and villages along the entire southern coast, from Kent to Cornwall. These raids created a constant state of fear and a demand for better national defense, which in turn cost even more money. The war was a financial black hole. The traditional forms of taxation were proving insufficient to cover the spiraling costs of defending the realm and funding campaigns abroad. The government of Richard II was becoming increasingly desperate for cash. It was this desperation that led them to experiment with a new and dangerously unfair form of taxation. This tax, more than any other single factor, would provide the spark that would finally ignite the Great Rebellion. The stage was now set. A population with a memory of newfound economic freedom and rising expectations was being held back by a legal system they viewed as oppressive and unjust. They were led by a government they saw as corrupt and incompetent, personified by the hated figure of John of Gaunt. This government, bankrupted by an unsuccessful war, was about to make a demand on the common people that would prove to be the final, intolerable straw. Part 2. the spark that lit the fire. The simmering resentment across England needed a catalyst, a single event that could unite decades of frustration into a focused explosion of anger. The government, blind to the mood of the country and financially cornered by its failing war with France, was about to provide one. The issue, as it so often is in history, was tax. The traditional methods of raising money for the crown were slow and inefficient. The most common was a tax on movable goods, a levy on a person's possessions, not their income. This was notoriously easy to evade. The wealthy could hide their assets, and the assessments were often years out of date. The government needed a new, faster, and more reliable way to fill its coffers. It was this need that led the king's ministers to a novel and profoundly dangerous idea: the poll tax. The name poll comes from an old word for head. A poll tax is a head tax. It is levied not on what a person owns or what they earn, but simply on the fact that they exist. Its great appeal to a government is its simplicity. You count the number of people in the kingdom, you multiply by the tax rate, and you know how much money you should receive. This simplicity is also what makes it so fundamentally unjust. A flat-rate poll tax is the ultimate regressive tax. It demands the same amount of money from the poorest farm laborer as it does from a prosperous merchant or a wealthy landowner. To the laborer, that sum might represent weeks of back-breaking work. To the merchant, it is a minor inconvenience. This inherent unfairness was about to be unleashed on the English people 3 times in the space of just 4 years. The first poll tax was levied in 1377. The government needed money to fund an expedition led by John of Gaunt. Parliament agreed to a tax of 1 groat for every layperson, meaning non-clergy, over the age of 14. A groat was worth 4 pence. This was not an insignificant amount, but for most families it was manageable. It was also presented as a one-time emergency measure to help defend the realm. While unpopular, it did not provoke widespread rebellion. Most people paid it, and the government raised a substantial sum of over £22,000. For the ministers in London, the experiment was a success. They had found a new, efficient way to raise money. This was a lesson they would remember. 2 years later, in 1379, the war was still draining the treasury, and the government came back for more. This time, they tried to address the obvious unfairness of the previous tax. The second poll tax was a graduated one, with a sliding scale based on wealth and social status. At the very top, the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, was assessed a massive tax of 10 marks, which was over £6. Earls paid £4, barons paid 2, and so on, all the way down the social ladder. At the bottom, the poorest labourers were still required to pay the base rate of 1 groat. On paper, this seemed much fairer. In practice, it was an administrative failure. The wealthy and powerful found ways to have their status under-assessed, and the complex system was difficult to enforce. The tax raised far less money than the government had hoped for. From this failure, the government learned precisely the wrong lesson. They concluded that the graduated scale was the problem. It was too complicated. They needed to return to the simplicity of a flat rate. This decision, made in the Parliament that met in Northampton in November of 1380, would be the one that finally lit the fuse on the rebellion. The government's financial situation was now critical. They calculated they needed the enormous sum of £160,000. 2/3 of this was to be raised by the clergy through their own internal taxes. The remaining third, a sum of over £50,000, was to be raised from the general population through a third poll tax. This time, the terms were devastating. The tax was to be levied at a rate of 3 groats, or 1 shilling, for every single person over the age of 15. This was a 3-fold increase on the original tax of 1377. To a 14th century farming family, it was a crippling sum. A skilled agricultural worker might earn 3 or 4 pence a day, meaning 1 shilling represented 3 or 4 full days of labour. The tax wasn't just on the worker, it was on his wife, and on any of his children who were over the age of 15. A family with 4 qualifying members would be faced with a tax bill of 4 shillings, a sum that could easily represent more than a week's income. It was an impossible demand for people who lived on the edge of subsistence. There was a small, almost meaningless concession. The legislation stated that within each village, the wealthier inhabitants should help the poor so that no single person would have to pay more than £1, and no poor married couple would have to pay more than 1 groat for them both. The crucial detail, however, was that the total amount collected from the parish had to average out to 1 shilling per head. This clause was almost universally ignored. In practice, the local collectors, often the same gentry who were supposed to be helping the poor, simply shifted the burden downwards, demanding the full shilling from households that had no possible way of paying it. The tax was perceived, correctly, as a monstrous injustice. The response from the population was a vast, nationwide campaign of passive resistance and evasion. When the first tax collectors came to the villages in the winter of 1380, they were met with a wall of deception. People lied about the number of people in their households. They lied about the ages of their children. Entire families would be missing from the lists. The tax returns that came back to the central government in London in early 1381 told a fantastical story. They suggested that the population of England had fallen by as much as a third since the last tax was collected just 2 years earlier. The records show a suspicious and sudden scarcity of teenage daughters who were often the first to be hidden from the official count. In some villages, the number of taxable adults recorded was half of what it should have been. The government knew it was being cheated on an industrial scale. The tax had brought in only a fraction of what was expected. The reaction of the King's Council, led by the Chancellor, Archbishop Simon Sudbury, was to double down. They viewed the mass evasion as an act of criminal defiance that had to be crushed. In the spring of 1381, they appointed a second wave of royal commissioners. These were hardened legal experts and members of Parliament, sent out from the capital with sweeping powers to investigate the fraudulent returns, to identify every single person who had evaded the tax, and to collect the full amount owed, with no excuses. They were, in effect, forensic accountants backed by the threat of force. It was the arrival of these men in the countryside that turned passive resistance into open violence. The flashpoint occurred on May 30th, 1381. One of the new commissioners, a member of Parliament named John Bampton, arrived in the market town of Brentwood in Essex. He was a man with a reputation for being thorough and uncompromising. He set up his commission in the town and summoned representatives from the nearby villages of Fobbing, Corringham, and Stanford-le-Hope. These were marshland villages, communities with a strong sense of independence. Bampton sat at his table, flanked by 2 sergeants-at-arms, soldiers who served as his bodyguards and enforcers. He produced the local tax returns and accused the villagers of lying. He knew, he said, that they had concealed people from the collectors. He demanded that they produce new lists of names and hand over the money they owed immediately. At this moment, one of the men from Fobbing, a local landowner named Thomas Baker, stepped forward to act as a spokesman. He addressed the commissioner directly. The people of his village, he said, had already paid the tax that had been legally assessed on them. They had a formal receipt from the previous collectors to prove it, and they considered the matter closed. They would not, he declared, pay a single penny more. This was an act of extraordinary courage. Baker was not just arguing a tax bill, he was openly defying the authority of a royal commissioner. Bampton was furious. In his world, common men did not speak to royal officials in this manner. He saw it as an act of rebellion. He turned to his sergeants and ordered them to arrest Baker. It was this move that caused the situation to explode. The assembled villagers, who had been watching the confrontation with growing anger, were not about to let their representative be dragged away. A cry went up, and the crowd surged forward. The 2 sergeants were quickly overwhelmed. Bampton and his clerks, seeing the mood turn murderous, abandoned their papers and their dignity and fled Brentwood as fast as they could. They were lucky to escape with their lives. The people who had driven Bampton out of town knew they had crossed a fatal line. They had assaulted an officer of the Crown in the execution of his duty. In the eyes of the law, this was treason, an offence punishable by a gruesome death. There was no going back. Their only chance for survival now lay in escalating the conflict, in getting others to join their cause. After the confrontation, Thomas Baker and the men from the villages retreated to the woods, where they began to plan their next move. Messengers were dispatched across the county, carrying the story of the victory at Brentwood. The news spread like a spark in dry grass. Almost simultaneously, a separate but similar incident was unfolding in the neighbouring county of Kent, where another investigation into tax evasion also provoked a violent response. The government, upon hearing of the trouble in Brentwood, made another fatal error. They sent the Chief Justice of the Common Bench, Sir Robert Belknap, to Essex to investigate the riot and punish the ringleaders. He arrived with a small force, intending to make an example of the rebels. Instead of intimidating the populace, his presence only inflamed them. A local army of peasants and townsmen confronted him, executed 3 of the local jurors he had brought with him, and forced the Chief Justice himself to swear an oath that he would never hold another such session in the county. They made him give them the names of the 15 royal officials who had sent him, all of whom were now marked for death. The revolt was now a regional insurrection, and it was gathering momentum with every passing day. Part 3. The March on London. The events at Brentwood were effectively a declaration of war. The man who had defied the King's Commissioner, John Bampton, knew that the full weight of the law would now seek to crush them. Their only hope for survival was to transform their spontaneous act of defiance into a full-blown insurrection. In the first days of June 1381, the rebellion that had been simmering for a generation finally boiled over. The news of the success at Brentwood travelled fast. Messengers on horseback galloped through the lanes and villages of Essex, carrying the story of their victory and the call to arms. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the county, local bands of men began to form. Their targets were carefully chosen symbols of their oppression. They marched on manor houses and sought out the chests containing the court rolls and legal documents. These were the records that detailed their labour obligations, the fines they had paid, the land they held in servitude. They dragged these papers and parchments into the village greens and set them ablaze in huge bonfires. Each burning page was a symbolic act of liberation, an attempt to erase the legal and historical proof of their serfdom. They also targeted people. They hunted down the local officials who were associated with the hated statute of labourers and the poll tax. Jurors who had served in the royal courts were dragged from their homes and beheaded. Lawyers were killed on sight. The rebels' logic was simple and ruthless. If they could destroy the records of their servitude and eliminate the men who enforced it, the system itself would collapse. As the Essex Rebellion gathered force, a parallel and even more formidable uprising was exploding across the Thames estuary in the county of Kent. The Kentish men had a reputation for being particularly proud and independent, and they rose up with a ferocity that quickly eclipsed the events in Essex. Within days, a powerful force of Kentish rebels had captured the town of Maidstone. There, they stormed the Archbishop's prison and released a man who would become the spiritual and ideological leader of the entire revolt. His name was John Ball. He was a priest, and a radical one at that. For at least 20 years, he had been a thorn in the side of the church establishment. He was what was known as a hedge priest, a travelling preacher who operated outside the formal church structure. He travelled from village to village, delivering fiery sermons in the plain English of the common people, and his message was pure dynamite. Ball preached a revolutionary form of Christian egalitarianism. He argued that the entire social structure of feudal England, the hierarchy of lords and serfs, rich and poor, was not ordained by God, but was a cruel invention of sinful men. He looked back to the very beginning, to the Garden of Eden, to make his point. His most famous sermon, which he delivered to the growing rebel army, was built around a simple, powerful, and unforgettable question, posed in a rhyming couplet. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Delved means to dig, the work of a male peasant in the fields. Span refers to spinning thread, the work of a female peasant in the home. Ball was asking, in the beginning, when Adam worked the soil and Eve worked the loom, where were the nobles, where were the lords and the gentlemen who now claimed to rule over them by divine right? The answer was obvious. They did not exist. In the eyes of God, all people were created equal. The class system, Ball argued, was a betrayal of God's original plan. He preached that the wealth of the great churchmen and the nobles was stolen from the labour of the poor. He called for a new society where all things would be held in common, where there would be no more lords and no more serfs, only a fellowship of equals under God. For these teachings, he had been repeatedly arrested and excommunicated by the church authorities. Freeing him from prison was one of the rebels' first and most symbolic acts. He was their prophet, the man who gave their economic and political grievances the unshakable force of a holy crusade. With their spiritual leader in place, the Kentish rebels now needed a military and political commander. They found one in a man whose name would become forever synonymous with the revolt, Wat Tyler. The historical record on Wat Tyler is frustratingly thin. We don't know for certain where he came from or what he did before the revolt. The hostile chroniclers of the time, writing from the perspective of the ruling class, offer conflicting accounts. Some suggest he was a Tyler from Essex, others that he was a highwayman. One of the most compelling theories is that he had served as a soldier in the wars in France, which would explain the remarkable degree of discipline and tactical skill he displayed in leading the rebel army. Whatever his background, it is clear that Wat Tyler was a natural leader. He was charismatic, articulate, and possessed a fierce and commanding presence. While John Ball provided the ideological fire, Wat Tyler provided the practical organization and the political focus. He was the one who forged the disparate bands of angry villagers into a cohesive army. He was the one who articulated their demands and the one who would ultimately step forward to negotiate face to face with the king. He was pragmatic, bold, and seemed to have a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve. He quickly became the undisputed captain of the Kentish host and the overall leader of the Great Rising. Under the joint leadership of Tyler and Ball, the Kentish army moved with speed and purpose. On the 7th of June, they captured the great castle at Rochester, a major royal fortress. They marched on Canterbury, the religious heart of England. They entered the city without a fight, opened the jail, and dragged the archbishop's officials from the cathedral. They forced the mayor and the city leaders to swear an oath of loyalty to their cause, which they called the true Commons of England. As they marched, their numbers swelled. They were joined by tradesmen from the towns, parish priests, and even some disaffected members of the local gentry who had their own grievances with the central government. While the Kentish army was consolidating its power in the southeast, the Essex rebels were doing the same to the north of the Thames. They too had found leaders, most notably a man known as Jack Straw, who some historians believe may have been an alias for Tyler himself, a way of suggesting the rebellion was everywhere at once. Like their counterparts in Kent, the Essex rebels systematically dismantled the apparatus of local government, burning records and executing officials. By the second week of June, two massive organized armies were poised to march on the capital. The Kentish rebels, led by Wat Tyler, numbered in the tens of thousands. The Essex rebels were of a similar size. Their plan was simple: to converge on London. The heart of the government they despised. Their goals, which had started as a simple refusal to pay a tax, had now grown into a revolutionary political program. Through the sermons of John Ball and the leadership of Wat Tyler, a clear set of demands had emerged. First and foremost, they demanded the complete and total abolition of serfdom and all the forced labor and humiliating fees that went with it. Second, they demanded an end to the hated poll tax forever. Third, they wanted a general pardon for any acts committed during the rebellion. Fourth, and perhaps most radically, they demanded the removal and punishment of those they considered to be traitors to the king and the kingdom. This last point is crucial for understanding the mindset of the rebels. They did not see themselves as traitors. In their own eyes, they were loyal subjects of King Richard II. They believed that the young king was a good and just ruler who was being misled by a circle of corrupt and wicked advisors. Their primary targets were a handful of men at the top of the government. At the top of their list was the king's uncle, the powerful and immensely wealthy John of Gaunt, whom they blamed for the disastrous war and the poll tax. Fortunately for him, he was away on a diplomatic mission in Scotland when the revolt broke out. Their other main targets were the Chancellor, Archbishop Simon Sudbury, who they saw as the architect of the poll tax, and the Treasurer, Sir Robert Hales, the man in charge of collecting it. The rebels believed that if they could just get to London, present their case to the king, and eliminate these evil councillors, the young monarch would see the justice of their cause and grant them their freedom. On the 12th of June, the Kentish army, with Wat Tyler at its head, reached Blackheath, a large open space on the hills just southeast of London Bridge. From this vantage point, they could look down upon the city they had come to confront. The sight of this vast, disciplined army camped on the edge of the capital sent a wave of panic through the government. The 14-year-old King Richard, along with Archbishop Sudbury, Robert Hales, and his other chief ministers, took refuge behind the formidable walls of the Tower of London. The city authorities were paralysed with indecision. They ordered the drawbridges on London Bridge to be raised, hoping to keep the Kentish host out. It was a futile gesture. The rebels had sympathisers within the city walls. The common people of London shared many of the same grievances as the men from Kent and Essex. An alderman, sympathetic to their cause, ordered the bridge to be lowered, and on the 13th of June, the rebels began to pour into the city. At the same time, the Essex army, led by Jack Straw, crossed the river from the north and entered through the city gate at Aldgate, which was opened for them from the inside. The two great armies of the revolt had achieved their first objective. They were in control of the capital. The stage was now set for a dramatic and violent showdown with the king and his government. Part 4. The Capital Falls. On Wednesday, June 12, 1381, the vast Kentish army, led by Wat Tyler, reached Blackheath. This was a wide, open heath on a rise of ground just a few miles southeast of London Bridge, offering a panoramic view of the capital. The sight must have been both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Tens of thousands of men, armed with the tools of their trades, billhooks, scythes, axes, and longbows, were now camped within sight of the wealthiest city in England. As they made their camp, the Essex rebels were doing the same to the north, creating a pincer movement that held the city in a grip of steel. The government and the 14-year-old king at its heart were now under siege. Inside the city walls, there was panic and division. The Mayor of London, a tough and decisive merchant named William Walworth, was in favour of a military solution. He wanted to shut the gates, man the walls, and fight the rebels. He was overruled. The common people of London, the apprentices, the artisans, the labourers, felt a powerful kinship with the men from the countryside. They suffered under the same laws, paid the same taxes, and despised the same powerful figures. The rebels were not a foreign army. They were their countrymen, and their cause was just. This sympathy proved decisive. On the morning of Thursday, June 13th, as the Kentish rebels marched towards the heavily fortified London Bridge, a city alderman gave the order to lower the drawbridge. At the same time, on the other side of the city, the gates at Aldgate were swung open for the Essex rebels. The two great armies streamed into London as welcome guests. For the young King Richard II, watching from a window in the Tower of London, this must have been a moment of pure terror. The most formidable fortress in his kingdom had become his prison. With him were the men the rebels hated most: the Chancellor, Archbishop Simon Sudbury, the Treasurer, Sir Robert Hales, his cousin, the young Henry Bolingbroke, who would one day be King Henry IV, and a handful of other terrified nobles and officials. They were the government of England, and they were utterly powerless. They could hear the roar of the crowd as it surged through the streets, a sound that signaled the complete breakdown of their authority. The rebels, now in control of the capital, did not engage in random, mindless violence. Their actions were precise, symbolic, and terrifyingly well organized. Their first major target was the Savoy Palace, the London residence of the king's uncle, the hated John of Gaunt. The Savoy was the most magnificent private residence in all of England, a treasure chest of art, tapestries, and gold and silver plate, designed to showcase the Duke's immense wealth and power. It was, to the rebels, the ultimate symbol of the corrupt elite that had mismanaged the kingdom and bled them dry with taxes. A huge contingent of rebels marched down the Strand towards the palace. They broke down the gates and systematically began to destroy it. Wat Tyler and the other leaders had issued a strict command: nothing was to be stolen. This was a political act, a demonstration of their moral purpose. They smashed priceless furniture and hurled it onto bonfires. They shredded magnificent tapestries with their knives. They found John of Gaunt's personal coat of arms and dragged it through the mud. They brought his vast collection of silver and gold plate out onto the lawn and hacked it to pieces with their axes before throwing it into the River Thames. They found his barrels of gunpowder and, not knowing what they were, threw them onto a fire. The resulting explosion destroyed what was left of the Great Hall. The discipline was extraordinary. One chronicler tells the story of a rebel who was caught trying to sneak away a small silver cup. His fellow rebels, furious at this betrayal of their cause, immediately seized him and threw him, along with his stolen prize, into the flames. The message was clear. They had come to cleanse the kingdom of corruption, not to enrich themselves. While the Savoy burned, other groups of rebels were settling different scores. They stormed Newgate Prison and the Fleet Prison, releasing all the inmates. They particularly targeted lawyers and anyone associated with the legal system. They burned the Temple, which was then the headquarters of the lawyers of London. They hunted down any official connected with John of Gaunt's administration. The city was in their hands, but the seat of government, the Tower of London, remained secure. As the day wore on, the pressure on the king and his advisors grew. They were trapped, watching the city burn, knowing that the crowd's anger would soon turn towards them. They had to do something. They decided that their only option was to try and negotiate. On the morning of Friday, June 14th, a message was sent from the Tower. The king would agree to meet with the rebel leaders. The chosen location was a place called Mile End, an open field to the east of the city walls. Shortly after dawn, the young Richard II, accompanied by a small and surely terrified retinue of knights, rode out from the Tower of London to meet his rebellious subjects. It was an incredible spectacle. A boy of 14, raised to believe he ruled by the will of God, was now riding to parley with tens of thousands of armed and angry commoners. As he approached Mile End, he saw them arranged in a vast, waiting army. Wat Tyler and the other leaders came forward to speak for the commons. The king, playing his part, asked them what they wanted. Their spokesman, likely Tyler himself, laid out their core demands. It was a revolutionary charter for a New England. First, they demanded the complete abolition of serfdom. All men were to be free, no longer tied to the land or their lord. Second, they demanded that land should be rented at a flat and fair rate of 4 pence per acre, ending all the arbitrary fees and labor services of the old system. Third, they demanded a free market, the right for all men to buy and sell goods and their own labor without the restrictions of the Statute of Laborers. Finally, they demanded a full pardon for everyone who had taken part in the uprising. This was the critical moment. The king was surrounded. His military forces were hopelessly outnumbered. A single wrong word could have resulted in his immediate death and the collapse of the monarchy. Richard, showing a courage and political cunning that was astonishing for his age, did not argue. Instead, he agreed to everything. He granted every single one of their demands. He told them that he would have charters of freedom drawn up for every county, town, and village. He even offered them his own royal banner to carry, a sign that he was now on their side, that their cause was his cause. To prove his sincerity, he ordered 30 clerks to be set up at tables on the spot to begin the monumental task of writing out these individual charters of manumission, freeing the serfs from their bonds. For the thousands of rebels gathered at Mile End, this was a moment of unbelievable triumph. They had marched on London, confronted the king, and won. Everything they had fought for, freedom, justice, the end of servitude, had been granted. The king himself had promised it. The revolt seemed to be over, and they were victorious. Believing the king's word, many of the more moderate rebels, particularly those from Essex, collected their newly written charters and began the long, joyful walk home. But Tyler and the more radical Kentish leaders were not so easily convinced. They were suspicious of the court and its promises. They knew that the men they held responsible for their suffering were still safe behind the walls of the Tower of London. While the king was making promises at Mile End, their followers were about to take matters into their own hands, in an act of violence that would change the course of the rebellion. Part 5. The King's Gamble at Smithfield. The charters promised at Mile End were a calculated deception. For many of the thousands of rebels gathered there, the king's word was sacred. They had won. They had achieved what their ancestors could only have dreamed of: the end of serfdom. Believing the crisis was over, huge numbers of them, particularly the more moderate men from Essex, collected their precious documents and began the long and triumphant journey home. They left London believing they were now free men. The heart of the rebellion, the hardened core of the Kentish army led by Wat Tyler, remained. Tyler was not a fool. He knew the promises made under duress were easily broken. He knew that their true enemies, the men they called traitors, were still alive and well, sheltered behind the walls of the Tower of London. For Tyler and his followers, the revolution was not complete. Justice had not yet been done. What happened next was one of the most shocking and significant moments of the entire revolt, an event that demonstrated the complete and utter collapse of royal authority. While King Richard was at Mile End making his promises, a large force of rebels, some say led by Tyler himself, marched on the Tower of London. This was the most formidable military fortress in the entire kingdom. Its walls were thick, its gates were strong, and it was defended by a garrison of over 600 professional soldiers, including men-at-arms and expert longbowmen. From a military perspective, it was impregnable to a peasant army with no siege equipment. The rebels should have been met with a hail of arrows and slaughtered at the gates, but that is not what happened. In a stunning failure of nerve and command, the soldiers defending the tower did nothing. The drawbridge was down and the gates were open, left that way for the king's party to return. The rebels, seeing their chance, simply walked in. The guards offered no resistance. Perhaps they were paralyzed by fear, unwilling to act without a direct order from the king, who was miles away. Perhaps some of them even sympathized with the cause of the commons. Whatever the reason, the heart of royal power in England fell without a single arrow being fired. The rebels were now inside the king's own stronghold. They fanned out through the castle, a strange mix of awestruck sightseers and determined executioners. Chroniclers describe peasants running through the royal apartments, sitting on the king's bed, and playfully jostling his mother, Joan of Kent. But the main group had a specific purpose. They knew exactly who they were looking for. They made their way to the White Tower, the central keep, and stormed up the spiral staircase to the chapel. There, they found their primary targets: Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England, and Sir Robert Hales, the Treasurer. The two men had spent the morning in prayer, knowing their time was likely short. The rebels dragged the two terrified officials out of the chapel and into the courtyard. Sudbury pleaded for his life, reminding them that he was a priest, a man of God, but the crowd was in no mood for mercy. To them, he was the architect of the hated poll tax, a traitor who had enriched himself while the kingdom suffered. They were pushed and shoved through the throng and out of the Tower Gate to Tower Hill, the traditional site of public executions. A great roar went up from the waiting crowd. Robert Hales was the first to be killed, beheaded cleanly. Then, it was Sudbury's turn. The executioner, a local man, was apparently unnerved by the task of killing the most powerful cleric in the land. He was clumsy. His first blow with the axe only wounded the archbishop in the neck. It took, according to one horrified account, another 7 agonizing blows to finally sever his head. The crowd cheered as the heads of the two traitors were stuck onto pikes and paraded through the streets before being mounted above the gate on London Bridge as a grim warning to all. The rebels had now done more than just burn buildings and destroy documents. They had executed the leading officers of the state. There was no longer any possibility of a peaceful resolution. It was a fight to the death. By the morning of Saturday, June 15th, the city was a powder keg. The king and his small group of advisers had returned from Mile End to find the tower violated and his chief ministers dead. The rebels, their blood up after the executions, were still in control of the streets. Wat Tyler was now the de facto master of London. It was clear that the promises made at Mile End had not been enough. The King's Council was terrified, but they knew they had to make one last desperate attempt to regain control. Richard sent a message to the rebel leader, summoning him to another meeting, this time at Smithfield. Smithfield was a large, open and treeless square just outside the northern walls of the city. It was a place of markets and tournaments, a public space large enough to accommodate the still massive rebel army. The king and his party arrived first. It was a small and vulnerable-looking group, numbering perhaps 200 men, including Mayor William Walworth and a handful of loyal knights, all wearing armor under their robes. They took up their position on the eastern side of the square. Then, from the west, the rebel army appeared, a vast sea of faces numbering well over 20,000 men, their banners and standards held high. It was an intimidating sight. From this great host, a single figure rode forward on a small horse. It was Wat Tyler. He approached the royal party with an air of supreme confidence, treating the king not as his sovereign, but as his equal. He greeted the king and shook his hand, then, in a gesture of deliberate disrespect, called for a flagon of ale, which he drained while still on horseback. Then he began to speak, and it quickly became clear that the demands he had come to make went far beyond what had been discussed at Mile End. The victory had radicalized him. He was now a revolutionary. His new demands would have torn down the entire structure of medieval society. He demanded that the property of the church be confiscated and its lands divided among the common people. All bishoprics, he declared, should be abolished, except for one. He demanded that all lordship should be ended, that all men should be free and equal, with the king as the only lord in the land. Finally, he demanded that all the lawyers and officials of the royal court should be executed. This was a program for a complete social and political revolution. As Tyler spoke, his behavior became more and more arrogant. He was surrounded by the king's men, but he acted as if he were in charge. A courtier, a squire from the king's own household, was heard to mutter that Tyler was the greatest thief and robber in all of Kent. Tyler overheard him. He flew into a rage, calling for the squire to come forward and drawing his own dagger. This was the moment that the Mayor of London, William Walworth, had been waiting for. Walworth was a hard man, a wealthy merchant who despised the rebels for the chaos they had brought to his city. Seeing Tyler draw his weapon in the king's presence was a flagrant act of treason. It was all the justification he needed. Before anyone could react, Walworth drew a short sword, a baselard, from beneath his robes and lunged at Tyler, striking him a glancing blow on the neck and shoulder. Tyler was wounded, but still in the saddle. At that instant, another member of the king's party, a knight named Ralph de Standish, spurred his horse forward and ran Tyler through the body with his sword. The rebel leader swayed for a moment. He managed to turn his horse and ride a few paces back towards his own men before he slumped to the ground, mortally wounded. He was dead. For a few seconds there was a stunned, absolute silence. Then, a great cry of betrayal went up from the rebel army. The rebels saw their leader cut down before their very eyes, in the middle of a truce, by the king's own men. It was the ultimate act of treachery. A ripple went through the vast army as thousands of archers raised their longbows, drew back their strings, and took aim at the small, terrified royal party. In that moment, English history held its breath. The king and his entire retinue were seconds away from being annihilated by a volley of arrows that would have left none of them alive. It was at this moment that the 14-year-old Richard II performed the single bravest and most remarkable act of his life. While his experienced knights and advisors were frozen with terror, the boy king acted. He spurred his horse forward, away from the safety of his own men, and rode directly towards the thousands of aimed bows. He held up his hand, commanding them to stop. He rode up to the front rank of the rebel army, close enough for them to see his face, and he shouted in a clear, unwavering voice, "Sirs, will you shoot your king? I am your captain. I am your leader. Follow me." Instead of threatening or condemning them, in the instant their leader was killed, he offered himself as their new one. He took ownership of their movement, co-opting their loyalty and redirecting it from the dead Tyler to himself. The rebels were stunned. They were leaderless, confused, and now faced with their young king, who had ridden into their midst and declared himself their champion. Richard, with astonishing presence of mind, turned his horse and began to ride slowly towards the open fields to the north near Clerkenwell. The great army of rebels, mesmerized and uncertain, followed him. The immediate crisis was over. The king was alive. The rebellion had been broken by the courage of a 14-year-old boy. Part 6. The Reversal and Reprisals. The apparent union between the king and his commons was a masterful illusion, a brief and shining lie that would soon be extinguished by a wave of brutal retribution. While the king was pacifying the crowd, the ever-practical Mayor William Walworth galloped back into the city and began to rally a militia. He gathered loyal knights, city officials and veteran soldiers under the command of Sir Robert Knowles, one of England's most experienced military commanders. Within a short time, a force of several thousand well-armed and disciplined men had been assembled. They marched to the fields at Clerkenwell, where the king was still keeping the rebels occupied with promises. The arrival of this army changed everything. The king was now surrounded by a formidable military force. The balance of power had been completely restored in his favor. His tone, which had been one of conciliation and leadership, changed in an instant. The mask of the rebel captain was dropped, and the face of the feudal monarch reappeared. He ordered the rebels to give up their banners, to disperse, and to return immediately to their villages. The bewildered crowd, without a leader and now facing an army of professional soldiers, had no choice but to obey. They began to drift away, their great enterprise broken, their victory at Mile End now feeling like a distant and uncertain dream. The great rising in London was over. The king's revenge was about to begin. The reversal, when it came, was absolute and merciless. King Richard II may have been only a boy, but he had a team of hard-nosed advisors and a deep-seated belief in his own divinely ordained authority. The promises made at Mile End were now treated as if they had never happened. They were nullified, declared to have been made under duress and therefore invalid. The charters of freedom, for which so many had risked everything, were revoked. The betrayal was made chillingly clear a few weeks later. A delegation of rebels from Essex, still clinging to the belief that the king was on their side, approached him at Waltham. They came to politely ask him to confirm the freedoms he had promised them. Richard's reply to them has echoed through history as a perfect, brutal summary of the ruling class's worldview. He looked upon the men who had so recently called him their captain and told them, "Villeins you are, and villeins you shall remain. In bondage you shall abide, and that not as before, but incomparably worse." These words were a declaration of war on his own people. The government, which had been on the verge of total collapse, now set about reasserting its authority with a terrifying display of force. Royal commissions, led by hardened judges and backed by soldiers, were dispatched into the rebellious counties. Their mission was to hunt down and punish anyone who had taken part in the uprising. The chief instrument of this terror was the new Chief Justice, Sir Robert Tressilian, a man who had become infamous for his ruthlessness. He presided over what became known as the Bloody Assizes, a series of show trials where guilt was a foregone conclusion. Local juries were intimidated into delivering the verdicts the Crown wanted. Anyone identified as a leader or who had been involved in the execution of officials was condemned to the most horrific death the law could devise. They were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a punishment reserved for the worst traitors, designed to be a gruesome public spectacle. The condemned man would be hanged by the neck until he was close to death, then cut down while still conscious. He would then be disemboweled, his entrails burned before his own eyes. Finally, his lifeless body would be beheaded and his limbs chopped off. The 5 parts of his body would then be sent to different towns and cities to be displayed on gates and spikes as a grisly warning against future rebellion. Hundreds of men suffered this fate in the summer and autumn of 1381. In Essex alone, chronicles record that 19 men were hanged from a single beam. So many were executed that there was a shortage of hangmen, and the government had to offer pardons to criminals who were willing to carry out the sentences. The royal vengeance sought out the leaders of the revolt with particular ferocity. Jack Straw, the leader of the Essex contingent, was captured and executed in London. The government's greatest prize was the man who had given the revolt its voice, the priest, John Ball. After the rebels dispersed from London, Ball had fled north. He was eventually found hiding in the ruins of an old building in Coventry and was brought in chains to St Albans, where King Richard and Chief Justice Tressilian were holding court. His trial was a formality. He was a heretic and a traitor, and his fate was sealed, but Ball refused to be silenced. He confessed freely to everything he had preached. He proudly admitted his role in the rebellion and showed no remorse whatsoever. He insisted that what he had done was right and just in the eyes of God. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Even the Bishop of London pleaded for a 2-day stay of execution so that he might save Ball's soul, but it was no use. On July 15, 1381, in the presence of the king, John Ball was executed. The reprisals continued for months. Any village suspected of having supported the revolt was punished with heavy fines. The hunt for rebels was relentless. Eventually, the sheer scale of the uprising made it impossible to punish everyone. To do so would have been to execute or imprison a significant portion of the workforce in the southeast of England. By the end of the year, the government's bloodlust was sated, and a general pardon was issued, although it excluded the main ringleaders and anyone who had been directly involved in the killings. The old order had been restored with a vengeance. So, was the revolt a total and abject failure? In the short term, the answer must be yes. Its primary goals were utterly defeated. Its leaders were hunted down and subjected to the most barbaric executions imaginable. Serfdom, far from being abolished, was reaffirmed by the king in the strongest possible terms. The common people were terrorized back into submission. The brief, exhilarating dream of a new society, a fellowship of equals, had been crushed and replaced by the grim reality of the gallows and the executioner's block. The rebels had held the government of England in their hands, and they had lost. Yet, even in this catastrophic defeat, There were the seeds of a hidden, long-term success. The memory of 1381 lingered, casting a long shadow over the relationship between the rulers and the ruled. The first and most obvious victory for the rebels was a fiscal one. No government dared to impose a poll tax on the entire population again for more than 600 years. The tax was so deeply associated with the uprising, so thoroughly discredited as a fair means of raising revenue, that it became politically toxic. The ruling class had learned a valuable lesson about the limits of taxation and the dangers of pushing the common people too far. The second, and more profound legacy, concerned the issue that lay at the heart of the revolt: serfdom. The king's declaration that the peasants would remain in bondage was a defiant statement of principle, but it could not hold back the powerful economic and social forces that were already at work. The Black Death had created a labor market that favored the worker, and the revolt added a new political dimension to that reality. While serfdom was not legally abolished, landlords became much more cautious about enforcing its harshest conditions. The memory of burning manor rolls and executed officials made them think twice about demanding unpaid labor or refusing reasonable requests for cash rents. Commutation, the process of replacing labor services with money payments, accelerated significantly in the years after the revolt. It was simply safer and easier for a lord to collect rent than to risk provoking another uprising. The revolt did not kill serfdom in a single blow, but it inflicted a mortal wound from which the system would never recover. Over the following decades, it slowly withered and died because of a change in attitudes, born of fear and a newfound respect for the collective power of the commons. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.